Ms. Miller was the victim of a murder-for-hire plot at the request of her abusive partner, who's the father of her children.
This was a murder for hire? Despite what police say, he says he doesn't buy that his father hired a hitman to kill his mom.
They say the ones who are meant to protect us can sometimes be the ones we should fear most. But what happens when that person doesn't want to do the dirty work themselves? What if they decide to outsource their violence, turning a personal vendetta into a cold business transaction? In the summer of 1992, the streets of Cambridge, Massachusetts, would witness exactly such a betrayal. Michelle Miller, a 29-year-old Army veteran and mother of two, vanished without a trace. 2 weeks later, her body was discovered in the filthy basement of an apartment building, partially naked and covered by a blanket. But this was no random act of violence. This was a calculated hit, orchestrated by someone who knew her intimately. For 32 years, her murder would haunt the community, leaving her children to grow up wondering who could have taken their mother in such a brutal fashion. The truth, when it finally emerged in 2024, would prove more chilling than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just murder, it was murder for hire, allegedly orchestrated by the father of her children, a man who had vowed to love and protect her. This is the story of how a domestic abuse victim tried to break free, only to have her life ended by a hired killer. This is the story of how justice finally caught up with her alleged murderer after more than 3 decades. This is the story of Michelle Miller.
I have strong feelings that my dad didn't ask this guy to do it. And, it was kind of weird to see murder for hire plastered everywhere yesterday.
And so the custody battle motive doesn't make sense.
It makes no sense to me at all.
But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask you a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensure you don't miss out on any new videos. Michelle Miller's story began far from the basement where her life would tragically end. Born into a working-class family in Massachusetts, she embodied the American spirit of determination and service. By the time she was in her early 20s, Michelle had already made a choice that would define her character. She enlisted in the United States Army, ready to serve her country with the same dedication she brought to everything in her life. Her military service shaped her into someone who understood discipline, courage, and sacrifice. But like many veterans, Michelle faced challenges when transitioning back to civilian life. The structured world of the military gave way to the uncertainties of everyday existence, and she found herself navigating the complexities of single motherhood with 2 young children to care for. Those who knew Michelle described her as resilient, always wearing a smile despite her circumstances. She was the kind of mother who would move heaven and earth for her children, working whatever job she could find to provide for them. Her friends remember her as someone who could light up a room, whose laugh was contagious, and whose strength inspired others. But behind that brave facade, Michelle was fighting a battle that few could see. Enter Daniel Innes, the father of her children and the man who would cast a dark shadow over her life. What started as a relationship full of promises quickly devolved into a nightmare of control and abuse. Friends began noticing changes in Michelle, the way she'd flinch at sudden movements, how she'd make excuses for unexplained bruises, the growing fear in her eyes. By 1992, the situation had become dire. Innes's jealousy and violence had escalated to dangerous levels, and he repeatedly threatened to take their children away from her. Michelle, showing the same courage that had driven her to serve her country, began taking steps to protect herself and her children. She confided in her social worker about the abuse, and on July 27, 1992, she made a decision that would unknowingly seal her fate. She told her social worker she planned to seek a restraining order against Innes. Michelle was doing everything right. She was following the system, trying to break free from the cycle of abuse through legal channels. She believed in justice, in the power of standing up for herself, but she couldn't have known that Innes had already set in motion a plan that would ensure she never got the chance to file that restraining order. The timing was cruel. Just one day after expressing her intention to seek legal protection, Michelle would disappear. The night of July 28th, 1992, started like any other summer evening in Cambridge. The streets of Central Square were alive with their usual bustle, students, locals, and workers all going about their business. Among them was Michelle Miller, last seen at the Prospect Buffet, a local restaurant bar that served as a neighborhood fixture. No one could have known that this ordinary night would be her last. What happened after Michelle left the Prospect Buffet would remain a mystery for decades, but we now know that sometime that night, she made her way to 245 Washington Street, a building that stood just blocks away. It wasn't a place anyone would choose to visit. The building was in deplorable condition. Its basement, particularly filthy and neglected. Yet, for reasons that would take 32 years to uncover, this is where Michelle's life would end. For 2 weeks, as summer heat baked the city streets, Michelle's whereabouts remained unknown. Her disappearance didn't immediately raise alarms, a tragic reality for many victims of domestic abuse whose absence often goes unreported or uninvestigated, but nature has a way of revealing what humans try to hide. It was a neighbor's complaint about a peculiar odor emanating from the basement that would finally lead to the discovery of Michelle's body. When police arrived at 245 Washington Street, they were confronted with a scene that would haunt them for years to come. In the building's basement, they found Michelle's body, partially naked and covered with a blanket, a detail that suggested both intimacy and contempt. The summer heat had accelerated decomposition, making it difficult for investigators to determine an exact cause of death. But one thing was clear: this was no accident. The crime scene told a story of violence, but it also held clues that investigators would spend decades trying to piece together. The location itself was significant. This wasn't a random spot, but a deliberately chosen location. The basement's condition, described by investigators as truly filthy, suggested whoever brought Michelle there knew the area well enough to know it would be unlikely anyone would venture down there. The positioning of her body, face covered by a blanket, hinted at a killer who might have known their victim. It's a detail criminologists often associate with perpetrators who want to distance themselves from their actions, unable to face the reality of what they've done. But was this a sign of remorse? Or simply a calculated attempt to hide evidence? The scene raised more questions than it answered. How did Michelle end up in this basement? Why was this location chosen? And perhaps most importantly, who would want her dead?
I made some important decisions this week, and it seems the weight of the world has been lifted off of me.
Daniel Irvin reads a note from his biological mother, written in 1991, explaining why she gave up custody of Dan and his sister.
I love you very much, and I wanted you to be safe.
The investigation into Michelle Miller's murder began with significant challenges. The summer heat had severely compromised the crime scene, washing away crucial evidence that might have immediately pointed to her killer. The basement of 245 Washington Street, already in deplorable condition, had become a forensic nightmare. But despite these obstacles, Cambridge police launched a full-scale investigation, knowing they were in a race against time. Initial witness interviews painted a fragmented picture. Several people remembered seeing Michelle at the Prospect Buffet that night, but accounts varied about who she might have been with or what time she left. The gap between her last sighting and the discovery of her body created a crucial window of time that investigators struggled to fill. It was like trying to complete a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The location of her body raised immediate red flags. The basement wasn't easily accessible to strangers, suggesting whoever brought her there was familiar with the building. Yet canvas interviews of nearby residents yielded little. Many were reluctant to talk, and those who did couldn't recall seeing anything unusual during that period. In a neighborhood where people tended to mind their own business, the silence was deafening. Detectives soon discovered Michelle's recent history of domestic abuse. Her social worker's records showed that just one day before her disappearance, she had expressed her intention to seek a restraining order against Daniel Innes, the father of her children. It seemed like an obvious lead, but at the time, investigators couldn't establish a direct connection between Innes and Michelle's death. Something was missing, a crucial piece of the puzzle that wouldn't surface for decades. The investigation hit another roadblock when the medical examiner couldn't determine an exact cause of death due to the body's condition.
And the ME, the medical examiner, was unable to determine an exact manner of death, though he noted it remained suspicious.
Without this crucial detail, prosecutors would face an uphill battle even if they identified a suspect. The case was slowly slipping away, joining the ranks of countless other unsolved murders where justice remained elusive. As weeks turned into months and months into years, Michelle's case gathered dust in the cold case files. Her children grew up without answers. Her family left to wonder if they would ever know the truth. But within the Cambridge Police Department, her case was never truly forgotten. Some cases haunt investigators, refusing to let go of their conscience. Michelle Miller's was one of them. Each year, on the anniversary of her death, detectives would revisit the file, hoping fresh eyes might spot something previously overlooked. They knew that somewhere in the stack of witness statements, crime scene photos, and medical reports lay the key to solving this case. They just needed time, technology, and perhaps a bit of luck to catch up with justice. The game changer came when Middlesex District Attorney's Cold Case Unit decided to take a fresh look at Michelle's murder. Their approach was different. Instead of focusing solely on physical evidence, they began digging through archived records from the Department of Social Services. It was here, in yellowing papers and faded documents, that they found what 3 decades of traditional investigation had missed. The records painted a disturbing picture of escalating domestic violence. Michelle's social worker had meticulously documented her struggles with Daniel Innes, creating a paper trail that revealed the terror she lived with daily. The timing of her disappearance, just one day after telling her social worker she planned to seek a restraining order, now seemed far from coincidental. But the most crucial discovery was yet to come. As investigators pieced together Innes's social circle from the early 1990s, one name kept surfacing: Edward Watson. He was more than just an associate of Innes. He was someone who could be placed in the vicinity of where Michelle was last seen. Watson, now 65 years old, had managed to stay under the radar for decades, living a quiet life that gave no hint of his alleged involvement in one of Cambridge's most notorious cold cases. The Cold Case Unit began building a timeline, connecting dots that had been there all along but never properly linked. They discovered that Watson had connections to the building on Washington Street where Michelle's body was found. The pieces were finally falling into place, revealing what investigators now believe was a calculated murder-for-hire plot. But perhaps the most chilling breakthrough came during recent interviews with Watson himself. After decades of silence, cracks began to appear in his facade. In what investigators describe as a crucial moment, Watson finally admitted to being present in the abandoned apartment at the time of Michelle's death. According to authorities, he described striking her first with his fist, then with a stick or board, details that only someone present at the crime scene would know. The investigation also revealed the alleged motive behind this murder-for-hire plot. Innes, who had already shown his capacity for violence through years of abuse, apparently wasn't content with just controlling Michelle's life. He wanted to end it. But rather than do the deed himself, investigators believe he orchestrated her murder through Watson, creating a layer of separation that helped keep this crime unsolved for so long.
We are confident at this point that we have sufficient evidence to have charged Mr. Watson, and the evidence indicates that he committed this murder allegedly at the behest of Mr. Innes.
On a cold morning in January 2024, as Cambridge was shaking off its winter slumber, law enforcement officers made their way to Mattapan, their target, Edward Watson's residence. For the 65-year-old man who opened the door that day, the past had finally caught up with him. The officers were there to arrest him for a murder committed when Bill Clinton was still running for his first term as president. Watson, appearing frail and using a cane, seemed a far cry from the man who allegedly carried out such a brutal crime 3 decades earlier. As he was led away in handcuffs, neighbors watched in shock, none of them suspecting that the quiet man who lived among them had been harboring such a dark secret for all these years. At a packed press conference just hours later, Middlesex District Attorney Marion Ryan stood before a sea of cameras. Behind her hung a photograph of Michelle Miller, young, vibrant, and smiling, a stark contrast to how she was found in that basement. To her right was a map showing the distance between the Prospect Buffet, where Michelle was last seen, and 245 Washington Street, where her life ended. Every detail was meticulously presented, showing just how thoroughly investigators had finally cracked this case. Evidence revealed that Miss Miller was the victim of a murder-for-hire plot, Ryan announced, her words sending shockwaves through the room, and that Mr. Watson had killed her in that basement, at the request of her abusive partner, Daniel Innes. The revelation landed like a thunderbolt, especially for Michelle's now adult children, who were hearing these details for the first time. The case against Watson seemed strong. During his 3rd interview with investigators, he had finally cracked, admitting to being in the abandoned apartment during Michelle's death.
Admitted for the first time that he had been in the abandoned apartment at the time of her death, and in fact, that he had struck her, first explaining that he did it with his fist, and then saying he did it with a stick or a board.
His confession included details that only the killer would know: the makeshift weapon used, the sequence of events, the specific location where everything occurred. But it was his connection to Innes that provided the final piece of this tragic puzzle. Daniel Innes, the man allegedly behind this murder-for-hire plot, had died in 2012 while serving a 15 to 20-year sentence for an unrelated manslaughter charge. He had taken whatever direct knowledge he had of Michelle's murder to his grave. Yet, ironically, it was the documentation of his abuse, the very papers Michelle had used to try to protect herself, that would help bring her alleged killer to justice decades later. Watson's first court appearance painted a dramatic picture of justice finally catching up with the past. Using a cane, he slowly made his way into the Cambridge District Court, appearing nothing like the man who allegedly carried out such a brutal crime 32 years earlier. The prosecutor detailed the evidence against him, including his own alleged confession and the web of connections linking him to both the crime scene and Daniel Innes. The arrest of Edward Watson brought a mix of emotions that nobody could have predicted. While investigators celebrated closing one of Cambridge's most notorious cold cases, the reaction from Michelle's family highlighted the complex nature of justice delayed. Her son, in particular, challenged the official narrative, struggling to accept that his father had orchestrated his mother's murder.
Choices were made. I don't harbor any ill will against them. I'm happy, the cold case team solved the murder and arrested somebody, but the way they're portraying everything is not reality.
His words remind us that in cases like these, the truth can be as painful as the uncertainty that preceded it. Both his parents, he explained, had made poor choices in life, but he found it hard to believe his father would have hired someone else to commit murder. Yet the evidence, according to prosecutors, tells a different story. Watson remains in custody, facing charges that could keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. The case against him stands as a testament to the persistence of cold case investigators and the power of preserved evidence. Even documents as seemingly mundane as social service records can hold the key to solving decades-old murders.
We are fortunate in Massachusetts to have first aggressor laws. People are much better trained in recognizing things. It is no longer a situation of this is a family matter and we'll let people work things out.
For the Cambridge Police Department, Michelle's case represents both a triumph and a sobering reminder. A triumph because justice, however delayed, finally arrived. But sobering because it took 32 years to uncover what might have been prevented if domestic violence had been taken more seriously in 1992. As one investigator noted, we handle these cases very differently today. The basement at 245 Washington Street, where Michelle's body was found, has long since been renovated, erasing the physical remnants of that horrific crime. The Prospect Buffet where she was last seen has changed hands multiple times. Cambridge itself has transformed over these 3 decades, but Michelle's story and the long road to justice remains as relevant as ever. What drives someone to have their children's mother killed? How does a killer live with such a secret for 32 years? And perhaps most importantly, how many other cold cases are out there waiting for that one crucial breakthrough? These questions linger, reminding us that behind every cold case file is a victim whose story deserves to be told, a family waiting for answers, and sometimes a killer hiding in plain sight. If this story moved you, take a moment to like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue telling these important stories of justice delayed but not denied. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this case. Do you think there are other cold cases out there that could be solved with a fresh look at old evidence? And remember, sometimes the most important clue isn't a DNA match or a fingerprint. Sometimes it's just a determined investigator refusing to let a victim be forgotten.